All right, let's pull back the curtain on one of the biggest and, frankly, most unspoken costs of doing business around the world: corruption and crime. We're going to jump right in.
Victor Hugo obviously wasn't talking about international business, but this quote, it absolutely nails the kind of environment where corruption really takes root. It's not just about a few bad apples. It's about the systems, the darkness, as he puts it, that let these kinds of things happen in the first place. So what does that darkness actually cost? In dollars and cents? Well, people have put a number on it, and you can think of it as a kind of unofficial corruption tax. In a lot of emerging markets, paying bribes can tack on an extra 3 to 10% to the cost of a project. And that's a staggering hidden expense that, let's be real, has to get absorbed somewhere down the line. But this isn't just about some extra cash on a balance sheet. No, the real cost of corruption runs so much deeper. In fact, it's deep enough to bring an entire economy to its knees. And look, that is not a statement to just gloss over. We're talking about the World Bank, one of the biggest financial institutions on the planet, and they're pointing their finger at corruption as the #1 thing holding developing nations back. It's like a systemic poison.
So how exactly does this poison spread? Well, it's a domino effect. It starts with bribes, which means the most incompetent contractor might win the bid. That leads to shoddy infrastructure. The national debt blows up to pay for it all. Economic growth just grinds to a halt, and pretty soon the country's slice of the global trade pie starts shrinking. We saw a textbook case of this in Slovakia back in the 90s. They had this whole system of crony capitalism, basically just giving massive deals to your friends, and it created a crisis that the country spent years digging itself out of.
And this is where things get really fascinating. You've got this huge gap between what big international companies say they do about corruption and what can actually happen behind closed doors. I mean, if you look at their websites or their annual reports, every major corporation out there has a zero-tolerance policy. They all project this image of perfect integrity. But when you've got immense pressure to hit your sales targets in a really tough market, that squeaky clean image can get complicated. And this quote from an anonymous executive, it just lays the whole strategy bare. It's willful ignorance. A big company just hires a local third-party agent, and then they make a very deliberate choice to not ask any questions. That agent handles the dirty work, and the corporation gets to keep its hands technically clean. The methods themselves have gotten a lot more clever, too. Yeah, the whole envelope stuffed with cash idea is kind of old school now. Today's corruption is way more sophisticated. It looks like a massive consulting fee paid to some government official, or maybe a prestigious scholarship that suddenly goes to their kid. Or how about an all-expenses-paid month-long negotiation trip to New York for the entire family? You see, it's a very, very thin line between bribery and just doing business. Right about now, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, aren't there laws against all this? And yeah, of course there are. But the story of those laws, well, that's where you really see why this is such a tough nut to crack. So the first big move was way back in 1977. The U.S. passed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or FCPA, and for a long, long time, it was pretty much the only law of its kind. Then, 20 years later, in 97, you get the OECD Convention, which brought a lot of other big economies on board. And since about 2004, we've seen prosecutions really start to tick upwards. But here's the thing, and this is really the core of the problem. Even with all these laws on the books, real-world enforcement is, well, patchy and weak are the words people use. It's one thing to have a law, right? It's a whole other challenge to actually catch and punish somebody for something they did thousands of miles away. So, okay, how weak are we talking? Let me show you with a classic example that really spells it out. So the story starts here. A contract worth $250 million. That was the prize an IBM subsidiary in Argentina was trying to win from a state-owned bank. And to lock down that massive deal, a bribe was paid out, $4.5 million, funneled through a local subcontractor to some of the bank's directors. Okay, but here's the punchline. The only reason this even came out was because of IBM's own internal investigation. And the fine they ended up paying? Just $300,000. To put that in perspective for you, that is 0.12% of the value of the contract they won. It's a rounding error. When a penalty is that small, it doesn't feel like a punishment. It just feels like a cost of doing business. So up to now, we've been talking about financial risk, legal risk, stuff you'd see on a spreadsheet. But in a lot of markets, the dangers are way more immediate and way more personal. I mean, besides corruption, companies often have to deal with direct threats from organized crime. And this isn't some abstract risk you read about in a report. This means you have to hire armed guards just to make sure your shipments don't get hijacked on the way to their destination. It means you're budgeting huge amounts of money for physical security. And sometimes the choices managers have to make are just brutal. Listen to this story. It's chilling. A German company director in Russia gets kidnapped. The company, on principle, refuses to pay the ransom. And he's killed. They send his replacement, who also gets kidnapped. This time the company pays, and he's released unharmed. These are the kinds of impossible life-or-death decisions people on the ground can actually face. So, if the laws have loopholes and the personal risks are literally life and death, what on earth is the solution? Well, the most effective answer might surprise you. It doesn't come from any government, it comes from within. The consensus from so many experts who are actually out there, on the ground, is that the single best defense against all this stuff isn't another law. It's building a fortress of integrity inside the company itself with incredibly strong and relentless internal controls. And you build that fortress from the inside out. It has to start right at the top, with the CEO setting a real, genuine zero-tolerance policy. It means giving your managers crystal clear guidelines on what to do when someone asks them for a bribe. And most of all, it means hammering home the message over and over that your company's reputation, which takes decades to build, is worth infinitely more than any one contract. Because at the end of the day, that hit to your reputation, that's going to cost you a heck of a lot more than any fine ever could. And maybe this is the best way to think about it, summed up in this amazing quote from a regional director. He said, engaging with corruption is like dancing with a gorilla. You might think you're in control at first, but when you decide you want to stop dancing, well, the gorilla decides when the dance is over.